I think there were not many people who understood just how broad his interests were and how supportive he was of an astonishingly wide range of organisations.
For decades, one whisper refused to die inside the glittering halls of the British monarchy, a whisper so scandalous that tabloids devoured it like hungry wolves. The Queen of England and her husband, the most famous royal couple on earth, were not living together, not behind the same palace doors, not even across the same corridor. They were miles apart, one sitting at the very center of the crown's power, the other hidden away in a quiet farmhouse by the sea. And the press turned it into a spectacle. Headlines screamed betrayal. Commentators hinted at marital collapse. People wondered if the greatest royal marriage of the modern era had quietly fallen apart behind palace walls. But now, something explosive has happened. Princess Anne, the royal family's most brutally honest voice, has stepped forward and shattered the myth. And what she revealed doesn't just change the story, it completely flips it on its head. Because when you peel back the palace gossip, when you strip away decades of tabloid exaggeration, the truth hiding underneath is far more shocking and strangely more powerful than any scandal the press could invent. The moment that ignited the rumors started in 2017. By then, Prince Philip had reached the staggering age of 96. After completing more than 22,000 solo engagements across 6 decades, a number so enormous it almost feels unreal, he announced he was retiring from public duties. Imagine that for a moment. 65 years of service, tens of thousands of ceremonies, endless handshakes, speeches, appearances, diplomatic events, a lifetime lived under the relentless spotlight of monarchy. When the announcement came, everyone assumed the next chapter would be simple. The Duke of Edinburgh would slow down beside his wife, perhaps long walks at Windsor Castle, quiet dinners in Buckingham Palace, a peaceful royal retirement together after 70 years of marriage. But that's not what happened. Instead, Prince Philip packed up and quietly left palace life behind. His destination? A modest 5-bedroom farmhouse tucked deep inside the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, a place called Wood Farm. Not a palace, not a grand residence filled with marble halls and chandeliers, just a quiet timber-beamed cottage overlooking the grey sea. The Queen remained in London and Windsor, continuing the endless machinery of royal duty, and suddenly the tabloids smelled blood. Royal rift, screamed one paper. Philip abandons palace, shouted another. After 73 years of marriage, is this the end? The narrative spread everywhere. Television panels debated it. Commentators speculated endlessly. How could a husband live miles away from his wife after decades together? Surely something must be terribly wrong. Surely the marriage had fractured behind closed doors. But here is the question almost nobody in the media dared to ask. What if the tabloids were completely wrong? What if this wasn't a breakup at all? What if it was the deepest proof of love the royal marriage had ever shown? Princess Anne now says that is exactly what it was. And to understand it, you have to travel all the way back to the very beginning of Elizabeth and Philip's marriage. The year was 1947. Britain was still recovering from the devastation of World War II when Princess Elizabeth married the charismatic naval officer Prince Philip. Their wedding became a symbol of hope for a battered nation. But from the very first night of their married life, they did something that would confuse the modern world. They slept in separate bedrooms. Now today that might sound shocking. People imagine icy marriages or emotional distance. But inside aristocratic British culture, it was completely normal. In fact, many upper-class couples believed separate bedrooms strengthened a marriage rather than weakening it. Philip's cousin, Lady Pamela Hicks, explained it with startling honesty years later. Separate bedrooms allowed couples to rest properly, maintain personal space, and still choose intimacy when they wanted it. And that choice, that voluntary closeness, made the bond stronger, not weaker. Think about the philosophy hiding inside that tradition. Love not as constant physical proximity, but as mutual respect. Not obligation, but choice. Elizabeth and Philip followed this arrangement everywhere they lived. Clarence House, Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Balmoral, Sandringham, always adjacent bedrooms, often connected by private doors but never forced togetherness. And somehow that structure supported one of the longest marriages in royal history, 73 years. So when Philip moved to Wood Farm in 2017, he wasn't breaking some sacred rule of marriage. He was simply extending a pattern that had existed since the day they said I do. But the real secret lies inside Wood Farm itself. Because that cottage reveals something few people truly understood about Prince Philip. For decades, he lived inside one of the most rigid systems on Earth. Every step choreographed, every room arranged by protocol, every moment defined by hierarchy. He walked 3 steps behind his wife in public for 70 years, a constant visual reminder that the Queen stood above him in royal rank. Now imagine reaching 96 years old after living under that pressure your entire adult life. Wood Farm became his escape. When Philip moved there, he didn't just retire, he reclaimed something he had sacrificed decades earlier, personal freedom. He redesigned the cottage himself, installed a new kitchen, hung his own watercolor paintings on the walls, rearranged the rooms exactly the way he liked them. Suddenly, the man who had lived in palaces designed by architects and managed by staff finally had a home shaped entirely by his own hands. And the transformation didn't stop there. He painted watercolors. He read constantly. He experimented with farming projects on the estate. He invited friends to stay for long weekends. Most astonishing of all, the staff at Wood Farm didn't wear uniforms. In royal terms, that detail alone was revolutionary. No ceremonial hierarchy, no palace theater, just ordinary life. And when Queen Elizabeth visited, which insiders say happened far more often than newspapers admitted, something extraordinary happened inside that quiet farmhouse. The Queen of England cooked. Yes, the monarch who ruled over a global commonwealth stood at the kitchen counter preparing meals. She washed dishes beside her husband, two elderly people, married for decades, sharing simple routines while the Norfolk wind rattled the windows outside. That image alone destroys the entire tabloid fantasy. Wood Farm wasn't an escape from their marriage. It was the most honest version of it. And according to Princess Anne, the world never understood this dynamic between her parents. She grew up watching it unfold every day, watching a father who sacrificed his naval career and personal ambitions to support the crown, watching a mother bound by constitutional duty that never truly allowed retirement. So when Philip finally stepped away from public life, Elizabeth gave him something priceless: freedom within the marriage, freedom to breathe, freedom to paint, freedom to live quietly without cameras or ceremony. That decision wasn't the end of their partnership. It was the ultimate expression of trust after 70 years together. And that is the truth Princess Anne has finally brought into the light. But the story of Wood Farm holds even deeper secrets. Secrets tied to royal history, tragedy, and a moment during the COVID pandemic that proved once and for all how unbreakable this marriage really was. Because when the world suddenly fell into chaos, Philip didn't stay in Norfolk. He went back to Elizabeth. And what happened next reveals the final chapter of one of the most extraordinary royal love stories ever lived. The truth is, Wood Farm was never just a quiet retirement cottage. Long before Prince Philip made it his sanctuary, the place had already been woven into the deepest layers of royal history, a house carrying memories that stretched across generations of the Windsor family. And once you understand that history, Philip's decision to live there begins to feel less like coincidence and more like destiny. The royal family first began using Wood Farm in 1967, when Philip himself selected it as a place where family members could escape the suffocating formality of Sandringham House. Unlike the main estate residence, with its strict protocol, endless staff, and ceremonial expectations, Wood Farm offered something the monarchy rarely allowed: normal life. It was smaller, quieter, and deliberately simple. The cottage sat about 2 miles away from the main Sandringham residence, looking out over the cold Norfolk coastline, surrounded by windswept countryside that made the entire world feel far away. Over the decades, the cottage quietly became a kind of royal refuge. Prince Charles used it as a retreat during his university years, hosting informal gatherings and shooting parties there, far removed from the stiff etiquette of palace life. Later, the young Diana Spencer stayed there during the early days of her relationship with Charles, back when the romance still looked like a fairy tale waiting to unfold. Even Catherine Middleton visited Wood Farm early in her courtship with Prince William, a quiet sign that the relationship was becoming serious enough to bring her deeper into the family circle. But Wood Farm also carried a darker chapter, a story buried so deeply in royal history that many people have never heard it. In 1917, King George V and Queen Mary faced a heartbreaking decision about their youngest son, Prince John. The young boy suffered from severe epileptic seizures that were becoming increasingly difficult to manage within the rigid expectations of royal life. At a time when society understood little about neurological conditions, the family made the painful choice to send him away from the public eye. Prince John was moved to Wood Farm, where he lived quietly with caregivers, away from the scrutiny of the royal court. He died there just 2 years later in 1919, at the age of 13. The cottage absorbed that grief like a silent witness to history, yet somehow, over the decades that followed, it continued to serve the royal family as a place of refuge and privacy, a rare pocket of genuine humanity inside the machinery of monarchy. By the time Philip retired there in 2017, the house already carried layers of royal memory. It wasn't simply a retirement address. It was a place threaded into the emotional DNA of the family itself. And then, in 2020, the world changed. The COVID-19 pandemic swept across Britain with terrifying speed, forcing governments into lockdowns and leaving millions fearful for the safety of their loved ones. For Prince Philip, the danger was especially severe. At 98 years old, with declining health and a history of heart problems, he fell into the highest risk category imaginable. Suddenly, the quiet arrangement that had worked so well, Philip at Wood Farm, Elizabeth continuing her duties elsewhere, became impossible to maintain safely. So, Philip left Norfolk. He returned to Windsor Castle to live with the Queen once again. The move was swift and without hesitation. The two elderly royals were were placed inside what palace staff began calling the HMS Bubble, a carefully controlled living arrangement designed to keep them isolated from the virus spreading across the country. Staff numbers were drastically reduced. Outside contact was tightly restricted. The enormous castle, normally bustling with courtiers and servants, became almost eerily quiet. And for the first time in years, Elizabeth and Philip were living together every single day again. Think about what that moment revealed. For decades, tabloids had insisted the marriage was distant. They pointed to separate bedrooms, separate residences, separate daily routines. They constructed entire narratives about estrangement and emotional distance. Yet when real danger appeared, when the world suddenly became uncertain and fragile, there was no debate, no delay, no second guessing. Philip returned immediately to be with Elizabeth, two people in their late 90s, married for more than 70 years, choosing to face a global crisis side by side. That is not the behavior of a broken marriage. That is the behavior of a partnership so deeply rooted it no longer needs constant proximity to survive. Inside Windsor Castle during those pandemic months, something quietly beautiful unfolded. Without the endless schedule of public engagements, without diplomatic ceremonies or state banquets, the couple found themselves living in a slower rhythm rarely available during their decades of royal duty. Meals were simple. Evenings were quiet. Conversations stretched longer than they had in years. The outside world was gripped by fear and uncertainty, but inside the castle there existed a small, protected world where two people who had shared an entire lifetime together could simply be husband and wife again. Two people who understood that love doesn't mean constant closeness. It means knowing when to give each other the freedom to breathe. And in the end, when the world needed proof of what their marriage truly was, Philip came back to Windsor, and Elizabeth stayed beside him until the final goodbye.